RPG. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear those three simple letters? Well, if you're someone who plays video games, there's a good chance your mind would instantly go to a fantasy-style world full of unique creatures and people. Or if you're a psychopath, you would think of a rocket-propelled grenade, which honestly would perfectly describe the strange Frankenstein child of Squaresoft I'm talking about today that came out back in 1998, Parasite Eve. Now, Parasite Eve came out at both the worst and best time imaginable, because back in 1998, gaming was on fire because it was shaping up to be one of the best years ever in the history of video games, if not the best, which if you lived in North America at the time, before Parasite Eve got released, you had an insane amount of amazing games released beforehand that year. Resident Evil 2, Mario Party, StarCraft, and Banjo-Kazooie, just to name a few. And even looking at when Parasite Eve came out in North America that year, which was on September 10th, you had Spyro the Dragon released the day before on the 9th, and a week before on the 3rd, you had the legendary Metal Gear Solid release. Also jumping into the last few months of 1998, you had games like Pokemon Yellow, Ocarina of Time, and Half-Life, so it was just an amazing year from start to finish. But Parasite Eve kind of got lost in the sea of greatness outside of Japan, with the rest of the world combined not even matching Japan's sales numbers, which to this day, Parasite Eve has sold around 2 million copies total, which is still highly respectable, so it's not like the game was a failure. I mean, Parasite Eve did get 2 sequels, though I will cover those in future videos, because I have so many thoughts about those games. But I do think one of the biggest problems with Parasite Eve back then, at least from my experience, so many wrote it off as a Resident Evil clone, and I'm even guilty of this. I didn't play the game for the first time till 2004, because I got told by a friend back then not to play the game because it was such a bad Resident Evil ripoff, and like an idiot, I took his advice till I finally got a chance to sit down and play the game and realize this is nothing like Resident Evil at all. Like, sure, it does have elements I would associate with a Resident Evil game, and you can see the influence Squaresoft took from the original Resident Evil at the time, but they also found a way to inject that Final Fantasy DNA into the game in a way that made the experience truly one of a kind, which only after returning to the game to replay it after 20 years can I truly realize how not only incredible Parasite Eve was for its time, but also the flaws that I know for a fact I overlooked back then. But I'll save those flaws for later, because I really want to talk about the story and art direction of Parasite Eve first. So the story starts off on Christmas Eve in Manhattan with the main character Aya Bray, who happens to be a rookie for the NYPD, going on a blind date with some guy at an opera house. Well, once they and everyone else gets settled in and the play begins, a little ways into the performance, the main actress Melissa, while singing, stops and stares deeply into the eyes of Aya, which is then followed by one of the coolest hardcore openings to any game I've seen to this day, with everyone in the building being set on fire through spontaneous combustion around Aya because of the power that resides within Melissa, who turns out to be the main antagonist of the game, Mitochondria Eve, and this really does set up the tone for the rest of the game. It shows you instantly that Eve is a serious threat to the people of Manhattan, while also laying the foundation and mystery that makes you really want to know why Aya was spared from this fiery fate, which leads to why I love both Aya and Eve so much as characters who oppose each other, because the back and forth you get between these two are fantastic. You have Aya, who really tackles challenges with logic and calmness you rarely see from main characters in RPGs, which makes the moments where she does truly get emotional that much more impactful, even without voice acting. Like when she's dealing with Eve, who multiple times throughout the game prods at Aya, trying to get her to join her side and leave humanity behind, with Eve's ultimate end goal to give birth to the ultimate life form and wipe out humanity. And these interactions makes you care about Eve as a villain. Like, this isn't some out-of-nowhere giant mythical boss you have to beat who is controlling things from the shadows that sometimes talk shit to you from a distance. No, you are constantly following Eve around the city, fighting her in multiple battles, watching her slowly transform further into a monster, yet somehow always being one step behind her as she leaves constant destruction and lives in her wake. But yet at the same time, Eve never truly feels like a monster because of the way she is portrayed in various moments throughout the game. Like later on towards the end of the game when she's pregnant with the ultimate life form and has this almost peaceful mothery tone that almost makes you forget what she has done to the inhabitants of Manhattan. And what really helps with this story progression of these encounters between Aya and Eve is the fantastic cast that surrounds them and the story moments that ties them into the main plot. First off, you have Daniel Dolis, who is Aya's partner in the Force and mentor. He's a loving father that is willing to put his life on the line for both Aya and his son Ben, who he has custody of after divorcing his now ex-wife Lorraine. And the game does a great job of tying this story arc into the main plot while highlighting Daniel's love and care for his son and even his former wife. It also does a good job of showing how his obsession with his job puts his family in distress, which comes back to hurt him as Eve takes advantage of this to try and get at Aya since he's her partner. As he not only loses his ex-wife to Eve, but his son gets put into danger inside the very police station Daniel uses to protect people, causing Aya to have to go rescue him, which by the end of the game, Daniels has a new perspective on life and the importance of his family and the time he spends with them. Next, you have Maida, a quirky, nervous scientist that comes to Manhattan from Japan after hearing about the Opera House incident at Carnegie Hall, who throughout the game assists Aya on her mission solving the mystery around Eve by providing insight into what's happening, and even making callbacks to the Parasite Eve novel incident, which is the prequel to the game. Which outside of assisting Aya and giving her a special weapon to use against the final boss, he also gives you these charms throughout the game showing how much he cares about Aya, though they do absolutely nothing but take up inventory space and annoy the hell out of you. And I remember when I originally played Parasite Eve, I hoarded these charms because I believed they would do something special if I kept them, when in fact they did absolutely nothing, and really shows how a game developer can mess with a player and make them believe something that was never stated in the first place. Then moving from there, you have Wayne and Taurus who handle the equipment at the police station, and while they don't get a ton of screen time outside of when you interact with them for upgrading weapons or storing items, you still feel the impact of their characters thanks to how well they convey their feelings in those few scenes. You also have Douglas Baker, who used to be Daniel's partner but is now the chief and boss of him and Aya, which, while also not having too many parts in the game either, his impact is still massively felt on the story, and that's something I ultimately love about Parasite Eve, even though it's not the longest game, usually taking anywhere from 7 to 12 hours on the first playthrough. It makes every moment feel impactful across the 6 days the game's story takes place over, regardless of how deep into a side character the game goes, like Shiva the dog. I love this little doggo, and it sucked seeing it transform into this hideous monster. But with that said, why did Shiva turn into a monster, and why does Aya resist the power of Eve? Well, that's because the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. You really think I was making a Parasite Eve retrospective without saying that? Shame on you. But jokes aside, basically the reason why Eve takes over Melissa's body and can transform creatures or burn people around her, which by the way, the transformation scenes are absolutely visceral in the best kind of way. Even though they haven't aged the best, the creepiness of watching these monsters transform is never lost to me. But anyway, this is because Maya, who was Aya's sister, passed away but had an advanced form of mitochondria inside of her body. So when her liver was transplanted to Melissa, those mitochondria infested her body, though they were only ever able to take over thanks to the immunosuppressant drug she was taking to help her body accept the transplant, which as Eve gained more control over Melissa's body, she came into contact with a scientist named Dr. Clamp, who just so happened to be an intern at the time the transplant took place, and who is now heading research into mitochondria at the Museum of Natural History, and this leads to a partnership between him and Eve to wipe out humanity, making him basically the second antagonist of the game. But going back to the transplant, Melissa wasn't the only one who got something from Maya. Aya also got Maya's cornea transplanted into her, so when Eve stares into the eyes of Aya, it awakens her mitochondria, and thanks to them being a bit different from Eve's due to how they mutated inside of Aya's body, she is able to utilize these powers to fight back against Eve and the various monsters she creates, which ultimately leads to my favorite thing about Parasite Eve, which is the combat and game mechanics that surround it. Now, the combat really is this strange mix of Final Fantasy with splashes of Resident Evil. As you move through the various areas in the city of Manhattan, you will notice the game has a fixed and moving camera style like older Resident Evil games. But then you encounter enemies like you would wandering around in a Final Fantasy game, but the battles aren't exactly random. Instead, there are these hot spots or locations where a battle can be engaged. So like at the beginning of the game under Carnegie Hall, in the hallways, this one spot will be the only place in that hallway you will engage in battle. So it really teaches the player over time to understand where enemies can be found, which can be used to farm resources or levels efficiently depending on what you're going for. Plus, since the battles take place in whatever environment you're in, instead of transferring the player to a traditional battlefield you would see in a turn-based RPG, it can make the dynamic of fighting the same enemies feel different based on your surroundings. Though I do want to note, Parasite Eve does a poor job with some of these camera angles. Like, the whole point of fixed camera angles or these moving cameras is to really frame each area in a unique way to deliver an experience to the player, which I would say Parasite Eve gets right 99% of the time, but there are these small moments where it's just like, why is that like that? Like when you're at Central Park, what is this camera transition? This is terrible, and I get why they do it. It's so they can set up more enemy encounters for different sections of an area, but it just has a funkiness to it that really isn't great from a presentation perspective. But also such a small detail, it really doesn't affect the enjoyment of the game for me at all, though I will never unsee how weirdly placed the exit sign is in the PlayStation. Like, how is it possible I walked past it only for it to appear again in the next frame? Like, who did this? But getting back to the combat, it's this interesting ATB style. As you wait for your action bar to fill up to allow you to perform an action, you're able to move around to dodge enemy attacks with Aya in real time, which, by the way, the less damage you take, I believe the more XP you get in a battle, so you really do want to try to dodge the best you can, even though it is pretty challenging. But when it comes time to attack, the action freezes when this green sphere opens up around you, which represents the range of whatever weapon you have equipped, allowing you to choose different commands, which usually consists of attacking enemies with your weapon, using items, or using your parasite powers, which have various effects like increasing your movement, ATB speed, healing, casting effects on enemies, and more. Though as much as I love this battle system, it really is a slow burn. It starts off not being the most engaging since you can only perform one action at a time when your ATB bar fills up, and your powers are nothing more than extra healing. But the further into the game you get, the deeper and more engaging the combat becomes. And what helps expand this system so much is all the customization available to the player, because as you make your way through the game, you acquire all kinds of different weapons and armors to use, and these will have various effects on them. Like, some weapon effects will allow you to perform multiple actions in a single turn, so you can cast something like haste and follow it up with an attack instead of choosing to do one or the other when your ATB bar is full. Or if you have triple command, you can use an item to heal, cast a barrier to protect Aya, and then follow up with an attack, so your options really open up. Then armor has various effects like auto-using items or protecting you from status conditions like darkness, which lowers your effective range of your weapon. So the options are pretty endless on how you want to customize your playstyle. But what exactly do I mean by customize? Well, within Parasite Eve, you have tools you can use to take effects or stats from one weapon and add them to another. So shotguns, for example, have the blast effect, which means it shoots out multiple pellets that can hit more than one enemy, and I can take that effect from the shotgun and add it to my machine gun. So now I have a rapid firing shotgun, basically that shreds everything in sight. And the same thing applies to armor with movement effects from one piece to another, which are also not limited to just one effect per item. You have these trading cards you can find and give to Wayne, which he then expands the number of effect slots on an item, so you can really customize your weapons or armor to your heart's content. though effects could never be moved from armor to guns or vice versa. Also, this is kind of where the Resident Evil influence comes into Parasite Eve with item management, because when you move effects or stats from one weapon or armor to another, whatever weapon or armor you took those stats from will be lost, unless you use a special kind of tool known as a super tool, which will preserve the weapon or armor, but they are very rare and even normal tools aren't exactly abundant, so you have to be somewhat mindful of what you're doing when optimizing your weapons, at least till you have tackled a certain post-game dungeon, which I'll get to later. But outside of these customization options, you also level up like you would any other RPG, and while this raises Aya's base stats, you also get these bonus points to spend on a variety of different options that further expands on the customization the game offers to the player, which can be spent to not only raise Aya's ATB bar fill speed and item capacity, but spent to raise individual stats on weapons and armor, so you can use them to increase a weapon's effective range or an armor's defense. So the game really does a great job promoting creativity with its systems, but unfortunately, while all this customization really does give a player freedom to build Aya how they want, you're almost punished if you mess with the systems too much, at least on a first playthrough. Because no matter how badly you want to test out multiple different weapons, armors, or effects, because of how limited you are with tools on moving effects and stats around in the first playthrough, and just the fact that you will lose those weapons and armors if you move stats or effects, you find yourself getting roped into focusing on a single weapon, armor, and not really being able to experiment as much as you would like with them. At least that's how it made me feel, which sucked because you have cool status effects like burn or freeze you can put on weapons, but if an enemy is resistant to them, they drastically cut your damage down to the point your weapon is almost worthless, and you can't just keep swapping out effects. So you end up just ignoring effects like those because it's not even worth engaging with them. So while the systems are really cool, they really are poorly optimized in that initial playthrough, but when they do start to shine is when you go into a second New Game Plus playthrough known as EXMODE. So EXMODE is an interesting New Game Plus mode for Parasite Eve. In your first playthrough, at a certain point, you can engrave a name onto a weapon and piece of armor, which these will be carried over with you into EXMODE. Also, any items you have stored away through Wayne will also carry over as well, which if you haven't noticed yet, Aya can't hold an infinite number of items, so you do have to store items away so you have space for whatever you find when out exploring, which you can find various items from potions that restore health to upgrades that raises stats on your weapons. And while it will seem like you have more space than you know what to do with, the amount of items you build up over time along with some items that can't be removed from your inventory, you will find yourself in desperate need of some more space. Though two things to note is first, any chest you come across, you can place an item back into it after taking an item from it, which can be super useful. But second, you can also discard items to clear space for something you want. So if you have something you don't care about, you can toss it away without needing to go back to Wayne at the police station or find a chest you already opened to store items into. But with that said, going back to EXMODE new features, not only does it give you bonus ports to spend at the beginning of each new day, which like I mentioned earlier, the game takes place over 6 days, which each day is basically a chapter in the game, it also increases the stats of all enemies, and some enemy encounters will feature more enemies in them, which adds a nice challenge for the player since Aya herself starts over at level 1. But the biggest change of all in this second playthrough is the Chrysler building being added to the map, which I should also say you use a map to navigate the city and enter the various locations in Parasite Eve, but the Chrysler building is this 77-floor dungeon where each floor is a random layout that you have to navigate with a boss at the end of every 10th floor. And while I do love a good post-game dungeon like this in an RPG, and I do enjoy the challenge of the Chrysler building, this thing is so poorly designed. First, every time you beat a boss, you get a key to use for an elevator to return to that floor. So if you're up to the 40th floor and beat the boss, you can use the key to return to any of the previous 39 floors without taking the stairs, which is useful to returning to the bottom so you can go resupply and tune up weapons at Wayne, since you will find the best items in the game here. Well, minus the junk weapons, which you can only get a junk weapon by giving away 300 pieces of junk by farming them from enemies, which takes quite a bit of grinding to say the least. But anyways, you will also find trading cards to give to Wayne as well in the Chrysler building, which if you find all of them, he will give you basically an infinite super tool, so you can finally customize items to your heart's content. Though at this point, you have basically already done everything in the game, so it's not as impactful, though still nice if you do want to do more playthroughs. But going back to the elevator, it's stupid the elevator doesn't run to each boss room. Instead, they are randomly placed somewhere on the floor the boss is on. Whoever decided this, man, I have some questions for you. Isn't it enough I have to go through endless black screens? Apparently not. Also, all enemies disappear from a floor after a boss's beat, which, while this does give you freedom to explore and look for missing chests in peace, I think it also sucks just for grinding purposes. I don't know, I'm just kind of split on it. Honestly, I really wish this would have been a more curated experience. Maybe instead of having 77 floors with the same hallways over and over again, we could have got like 30 floors of interesting and grotesque environments like you see when you reach past the 70th floor. Though I will say that initial impact of seeing the change in environment when you get up to where the original Eve is really does hit much harder after staring at non-stop yellow hallways for 5+ hours. Also, while the general enemies of the game and lack of variety is massively highlighted when going through the Chrysler building, the boss fights, especially the unique ones only found in this post-game dungeon, really are amazing and makes the entire trip through this hellhole worth it. So while the Chrysler building wasn't perfect, it definitely rewards you every step of the way. And really, the whole game does a good job of this. While you would think having an RPG take place in a city like Manhattan would make it boring in terms of environments, the team at Squaresoft really found ways to make each area feel unique in its own way, with standout sites that really highlights your experience in that area. Like the hospital, it's easily one of my favorite areas. While most environments in Parasite Eve is a pretty on-rails experience, the hospital does such a good job of creating that classic Resident Evil feel, just on a smaller scale, with you exploring, finding fuses and keys to progress through some backtracking. It really is an awesome area in the game, though I will say I did die on the rooftop after beating the boss because I completely forgot how to get off the rooftop before the jet crashes into it. So there are some moments where it would have been nice to have a little more indication on where I needed to go. Though I will say the ending sequence with the final boss after battling through all of those forms feels absolutely terrifying because of the lack of indication on what you need to do in situations like that. So maybe it's not all so bad. Not to mention, I can't forget about the absolutely legendary music created by Yoko Shimomura for Parasite Eve, which for those of you who don't know, she has done tracks for some legendary games and franchises like Mega Man, Kingdom Hearts, and my favorite game of all time, Super Mario RPG. She really is such a legend, and I can't express enough how amazing her music is. And when you package that music into the themes and world of Parasite Eve, you truly get one of the most memorable RPGs that perfectly captures the aspects of what makes the genre so great, while also mixing in these grounded horror elements that just brings everything together perfectly. So while Parasite Eve isn't the first game to combine the two genres of horror and RPGs, it's one of the best to do it, and even while there are games that have battle systems like it, when you take in every aspect of Parasite Eve's systems and grounded approach to storytelling, there is no game like it to this day. Not even its sequels are like it, which is why it's not only a masterpiece to me despite some of its flaws in areas like Aya not having whatever weapon you have equipped showing outside of battles, it truly is a cinematic RPG that I really do hope we someday get a remake of, because Aya is easily one of the best female protags in gaming and deserves a redemption to her.